When you think about the sweep of American history, doesn't your mind just naturally wander westward
Oh, absolutely.
to that legendary era of cowboys, gold strikes, and, seemingly endless horizons?
Hmm.
Well, that's exactly where we're headed today, getting into the American frontier, sometimes called the Old West, or maybe more famously, the Wild West.
Right.
Our main source for this deep dive is the Wikipedia article, American Frontier. And really, our mission is to try and grasp the core of this pivotal time, from its origins right up to its powerful hold on our imagination.
Yeah, it's a fascinating period.
So to sort of kick things off, what fundamentally defines this American frontier we're talking about?
Well, at its heart, we're really looking at the geography, the history, the folklore, and the culture that developed as the United States expanded westward.
Okay.
And it wasn't like a sudden thing. It was gradual, starting with European settlements way back in the 17th century, and basically ending when the last contiguous Western territories became states in 1912.
Wow, that's a huge span of time and a massive area, too. It wasn't just people deciding to move on their own, was it? Like, what were the main drivers behind this westward push?
No, definitely not just individuals. There were some key factors. President Thomas Jefferson was a big supporter, especially after the Louisiana Purchase in 1803.
Right, that doubled the country's size.
Exactly. And that really amplified this idea of manifest destiny. The belief that American expansion across the continent was basically inevitable, even God-given. And then there's the frontier thesis from historian Frederick Jackson Turner. He argued that this westward movement, the challenges of the frontier, fundamentally shaped American character and democracy.
That idea that the frontier shaped America still feels really ingrained, doesn't it? That sort of independent spirit.
It really does. It's deep in the national consciousness.
But this history can't have been simple. The words West and frontier themselves must have changed meaning over time.
Absolutely. They were constantly shifting concepts as settlement pushed further west. Popular culture often zooms in on the Wild West part, late 19th, early 20th century, maybe 1850s to 1910s.
Yeah, the Hollywood version, gunfights, boomtowns.
Exactly that. And while it makes for great movies and TV shows, it's often, let's say, a very romanticized view. Sometimes pretty distorted, actually.
Okay, so if we try to look beyond the movies, what are the essential pieces of this frontier history? What are the main takeaways?
Well, historians Hein and Farragher give a good perspective. They basically say frontier history is about building and defending communities, figuring out land use, developing economies, farming, trade, all of it, and ultimately forming states.
So community building, economy, statehood.
Right, and it definitely includes conquest, no doubt about it. But it's also full of stories of survival, adaptation, and importantly, the mixing of different cultures and peoples.
And that idea, Turner emphasized the availability of free land being such a powerful draw. What's the deeper meaning there?
Well, the idea of getting land you could farm was incredibly powerful. It represented a chance for a better life, economic independence that maybe wasn't possible back east or in Europe.
So it wasn't just about food, it was about freedom.
Exactly. Owning land was often tied up with ideas of personal liberty, having a say in things, voting rights in many cases.
Okay, let's go right back.
Yeah.
Colonial frontier, before 1776. What did West even mean to those early settlers?
Back then, starting with Jamestown in 1607, the frontier was basically anywhere inland, beyond the first settlements clustered along the Atlantic coast. It was the edge, the unknown.
And the different European powers, they didn't all approach it the same way, did they?
Not at all. Very different patterns. The French, for instance, didn't have huge numbers migrating to Canada. They were mostly focused on the fur trade, St. Lawrence River, Great Lakes.
So trading posts more than towns.
Yeah, smaller villages, trading posts, think Kaskaskia and New Orleans eventually, but even the fur traders going deep inland didn't really set up big farming communities.
Okay. What about the Dutch around New York?
Yeah. They started with fur trading too, Hudson Valley. Later, they had these huge land grants, patroonships with tenant farmers. That led to some pretty dense rural settlements, but they weren't pushing west quite like the English, more consolidating where they were.
Which sounds quite different from the English approach. What was driving them?
For the English colonists, owning land as individual farmers was, well, a huge priority. Their population grew, so they looked west for new farmland.
Land was opportunity.
Big time. And Unlike in England, owning land was more achievable here. It meant status, independence, and often the right to vote. That was huge.
So that desire for land was tied up with freedom and self-government right from the start.
Precisely. And their settlements, especially in New England, were often pretty compact, community-focused. But that push west for land inevitably caused friction, conflict with Native American tribes.
Over land, basically.
Over land, over sovereignty, fundamentally. Early on, the frontier was areas like the Connecticut River Valley, northern New England.
And this early time also saw major wars between the European powers, right? Fighting for control.
Oh, definitely. The frontier was often contested ground. The French and Indian War, part of the bigger 7 Years' War in Europe, was massive.
And the British won that one.
They did. Even though the French had fewer colonists, they were good at making alliances with native tribes. But Britain won decisively in 1763. The Treaty of Paris afterwards saw France give up huge territories in North America to Britain and Spain. Changed the map completely.
A major power shift. But people kept moving west anyway.
Absolutely. Even during and after those wars, settlers kept crossing the Appalachians into western Pennsylvania, West Virginia, the Ohio country, down into Kentucky, Tennessee.
Through places like the Cumberland Gap.
Exactly. That was key. Figures like Daniel Boone became legends, leading people through. Even George Washington was promoting settlement out in what's now West Virginia.
Didn't the British government try to stop that for a bit?
Yeah. The Royal Proclamation of 1763 tried to limit settlement west of the Appalachians, partly to manage relations with native tribes. But it was hard to enforce, and the Treaty of Fort Stanwix in 1768 pretty much opened those lands back up. The pressure was immense.
Okay, let's jump ahead. After 1776, the new United States is formed. How did this new government handle westward expansion?
Well, initially the policy was quite deliberate. Cautious, even. They were trying to balance the needs of the established East with developing the West.
What were the main goals?
Several things. Boost the economy, obviously, but also avoid draining too many skilled workers from the East. They wanted to distribute land fairly, sell it at prices that helped pay off the war debt, but were still reasonable for settlers.
And making sure people actually owned the land legally?
Oh, clear titles were crucial. Avoid disputes, and they wanted a diverse economy out West, not just farming.
So a structured approach at first?
Yeah.
But that changed, right, as the 1800s went on.
It really did. By the 1830s, you had lots of squatters people settling land without formal title. Andrew Jackson and the Democrats tended to favor making land cheap and easy to get for these folks.
Which clashed with other views.
Yeah, figures like Henry Clay worried about, as he put it, a lawless rabble heading west, thought it could destabilize things. And then you had Southern interests wanting Western land for expanding slavery and plantations.
And the anti-slavery side.
Right. The free soil movement picked up steam. They wanted cheap land, but specifically for free white farmers, no slavery. That idea eventually led to the Republican Party's Homestead Act in 1862.
The Homestead Act feels like a really big deal. 160 free acres.
Huge deal. Made land ownership much more accessible, theoretically at least. And migration westward really picked up speed after the Revolution ended.
People were eager to move.
Definitely. Marietta, Ohio, founded 1788, was the first permanent American settlement in the Northwest Territory under the new system.
And that early movement, we have to talk about the Wilderness Road, right?
That's, absolutely critical. But it was rough. Blazed by Boone in 75, went through the Cumberland Gap into Kentucky, mainly usable on foot or horseback at first.
But lots of people used it.
Tens of thousands. It was the main way into Kentucky. But dangerous, too. Attacks by native groups were common. Abraham Lincoln's grandfather was actually killed by Native Americans near Louisville in 1784.
Wow. A reminder that even if settlers saw Kentucky as empty, it wasn't uncontested.
Not at all. Raiding parties were active. So yeah, acquiring native lands often involved violence and pushing people out.
Sadly, yes. That seems like a constant theme.
It is. The War of 1812 was another big chapter in that struggle. It was kind of the last major attempt by the British and allied native tribes to stop U.S. expansion in the Northwest.
The British wanted a buffer state.
Yeah, an independent native nation there. But American victories under generals like Andrew Jackson and William Henry Harrison, plus the death of Tecumseh, the Shawnee leader, basically ended that resistance.
And the settlers were often on their own in these fights.
Often, yes. The U.S. Army was still developing. Federal help was limited sometimes.
So by about 1810, the edge of settlement reaches the Mississippi. Places like St. Louis become key.
Absolutely. St. Louis was the biggest town on the frontier then, a major gateway west, huge for trade. Interestingly, it was Spanish until the Louisiana Purchase in 1803.
Right, the Louisiana Purchase. That just fundamentally changed the map.
Doubled the size of the U.S., basically overnight, for $15 million. Jefferson saw it as vital for creating his vision of a republic of small, independent farmers.
So not everyone agreed at the time.
No, the Federalists were opposed, but Jefferson's vision of an expanding agrarian nation won out.
And all that new land meant new economic chances, like the fur trade moving further west.
Exactly. Guys like John Jacob Astor saw huge potential. His American Fur Company aimed to take on the British Hudson's Bay Company. He even set up Fort Astoria out on the Columbia River in 1811, first American settlement there, though it wasn't immediately profitable.
But he eventually built a powerful company.
He did. By the 1820s, he had a near monopoly in many areas.
And the fur traders themselves, they were often the first Europeans really exploring these areas, weren't they?
Absolutely. They were the vanguard, way ahead of settlers, chasing beavers mostly. They learned the land, made contacts, sometimes peaceful, sometimes not with native tribes.
And found key routes.
Yeah, like the South Pass through the Rockies. Crucial later for the wagon trails, they had this whole rendezvous system where they'd meet up once a year to trade furs and get supplies.
But that era didn't last forever.
No, fashion changed. Beaver hats went out of style in Europe by the mid-1840s. The demand collapsed, and that was pretty much the end for the classic mountain men Jedediah Smith, Hugh Glass, Davy Crockett.
Beyond private companies, the federal government was also actively helping expansion, right? With infrastructure.
Very much so. The Army Corps of Engineers improved river navigation, which was huge once steamboats came along. First one on the Ohio was 1811.
Made transport much easier, cheaper.
Dramatically, especially on the Mississippi and Missouri systems. The Army even helped improve steamboat designs for those western rivers. And of course, they built forts and tried to protect settlers on the trails. That was constant debate. How many forts? Where? How big?
And it wasn't just soldiers and engineers. There were scientists, artists, explorers mapping things out.
Definitely. Government and private expeditions. You had explorers like Zebulon Pike, Stephen Long called the Great Plains, the Great American Desert, which kind of slowed settlement there for a bit.
Oops.
Yeah. Then naturalists like Thomas Nuttall documented plants and animals. Artists like George Catlin and Carl Bodmer painted native cultures and landscapes. Invaluable records now. John James Audubon and his birds.
And Fremont, the path marker.
Right. John Charles Fremont. His expeditions in the 1840s provided really important maps and information, and his reports were exciting, full of adventure. They really inspired people to head west.
Okay, let's shift into the antebellum years, say 1849 to 1865. What's happening with expansion then?
Well, the Southwest had seen migration earlier, 1770s to 1830s, Kentucky, Alabama, Texas, mostly farm families. Sometimes their initial farming methods weren't very sustainable, actually.
And guidebooks become more common.
Yeah, by the 1840s, you get more guidebooks using info from fur traders in Fremont, promising fertile land out west.
And this is when things really heat up with Mexico.
Yeah.
Regarding Texas and California.
Exactly. Mexico wins independence from Spain in 1821, inherits those northern territories. Trade opens up Santa Fe Trail, El Camino Real further south. Then comes the Texas Revolution.
Leading to the Independent Republic of Texas.
Right, which sets the stage for the Mexican-American War.
And the outcome of that war.
Yeah.
Huge land gains for the U.S.
Massive. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848 ceded California and the New Mexico Territory. Then the Gadsden Purchase added southern Arizona later.
But all that new land immediately raises the slavery question again, doesn't it? Big time. The Wilmot Proviso tried to ban slavery in any land won from Mexico. It failed. But the debate raged. The Compromise of 1850 tried to patch things over, and part of that deal was admitting California as a free state in 1850.
And just before California statehood, gold is discovered. 1849, the gold rush.
Yeah, 1848 technically, but the rush hits in 49. A game changer. It pulled people west like nothing before. The 49ers.
Huge population boom in California.
Unbelievably fast, especially in the gold districts. Boom towns like San Francisco exploded. Housing costs went crazy. They were using abandoned ships in the bay for housing at one point.
Wow. And life in the gold fields.
Pretty rough. Primitive conditions, bad food, lots of men, lots of drinking, violence. With no real government at first, miners actually created their own informal legal systems, mining codes to handle claims and disputes.
While people rushed to California, others were heading to Oregon and California via the Oregon Trail. Tell us about that.
It became the main overland highway west. Over 2,000 miles from Missouri. People usually traveled in organized wagon trains with elected leaders, wagon masters, along tough journey.
Incredibly tough. Took maybe 6 months. You had to cross plains, rivers, mountains, all in one season before the snow hit. The first big migrant train was around 1836, and other trails branched off it, like the California Trail and the Mormon Trail.
Right, the Mormons. Their move to Utah is another major story from this period. Why did they go?
They faced intense persecution back east Missouri, Illinois, because of their religion. Brigham Young led them west looking for isolation, a place to practice freely. They settled in the Great Salt Lake Valley, which was actually still Mexico then.
And they made it work there, in the desert.
They did. They set up Deseret, their own sort of theocracy, with Salt Lake City as the hub. They were incredibly organized, used irrigation brilliantly, and built thriving farm communities.
How were their relations with native tribes?
Complex. Brigham Young had that famous line, "It is cheaper to feed them than to fight them." So they often tried negotiation and trade, but there were definitely conflicts too. They also really prioritized education from the start.
This era also sees the Pony Express and then the telegraph. Big changes in communication.
Yeah, the Pony Express was amazing riders racing across the country, but very short-lived. Started 1860, gone by 61.
That's so short.
The transcontinental telegraph line was finished in 1861. Suddenly, messages could cross the country in minutes, not days, made the Pony Express obsolete overnight.
Then we get to Bleeding Kansas, a really dark chapter showing how intense the slavery debate had become.
Terribly intense. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 said settlers in those territories could decide for themselves about slavery, popular sovereignty.
Who both sides rushed in.
Exactly. Pro-slavery settlers from Missouri, anti-slavery free soilers from the North, often funded by outside groups. It led to outright violence, guerrilla warfare. That's why they called it Bleeding Kansas. About 56 people were killed in the political violence.
And it showed compromise was failing.
It really did. It showed how intractable the slavery issue was. Kansas eventually came into the Union as a free state in 1861, but the conflict there was a major step towards the Civil War.
Now, the Civil War itself. We mostly think of battles in the East, but what happened out West?
There was definitely a Western theater, the Trans-Mississippi. Fewer huge battles like Gettysburg, but lots of guerrilla fighting, especially in Missouri and Arkansas. Control of rivers, resources like gold mines was important.
And the Army was still dealing with Native American issues during the war.
Yes, they still had troops garrisoning forts trying to keep peace between tribes and settlers. Although troop numbers were reduced, it was a tough job.
But conflict still happened.
Tragically, yes. The Sioux Uprising, or Dakota War in Minnesota, happened in 1862, and with fewer regular troops, militias sometimes took action, leading to terrible events like the Sand Creek Massacre in Colorado in 1864 against Cheyenne and Arapaho people. Kit Carson was also involved in forcing the Navajo onto a reservation during this time.
After the Civil War ends in 1865, the focus shifts back more fully to the West, right? To governance and development.
Right. With slavery settled, the federal government could really focus on organizing the territories. They generally followed the model of the old Northwest Ordinance, creating territories, setting them up for eventual statehood, establishing courts, governors.
More federal bureaucracy.
Definitely an increase. More standardized procedures, more federal officials involved.
Was there tension between the territories in Washington?
Oh, yeah. A constant push and pull. People out west often complain about federal control or corrupt local officials appointed from back east.
They also wanted federal money.
Exactly. Wanted funds for roads, military protection, mail service. Territorial governors were usually political appointees and didn't always have much local clout. The elected territorial legislatures actually had quite a bit of power over local matters, but it was also an environment where, yeah, corruption could happen. Mark Twain wrote about some of it.
And federal land policy continued to evolve after the war.
Yes, the Homestead Act of 1862 was still key, that 116 acres of free land for farming it. And the Pacific Railroad Act, also 1862, was huge. It gave massive land grants to private companies to build the Transcontinental Railroad.
How did those land grants work?
Often in a checkerboard pattern, the railroad got alternating sections of land along the route, and the government kept the sections in between, often for homesteaders, though sometimes homestead tracts near railroads were reduced in size.
So the railroads were crucial for settlement.
Absolutely pivotal. They actively recruited settlers, advertised heavily in the East and Europe, offered cheap transport, credit. They had a huge incentive to get people living along their lines.
Tell us more about building the Transcontinental Railroad. That must have been an incredible undertaking.
Incredible. The government had done surveys for routes before the war, but disagreements over slavery stalled things. Once the South seceded, the Republicans pushed it through.
Private companies built it.
Yes, the Central Pacific, building east from California, and the Union Pacific, building west from Omaha. They relied heavily on immigrant labor Chinese workers for the Central Pacific, Irish for the Union Pacific, plus Civil War veterans and others.
And they met in?
Promontory Summit, Utah in 1869. A huge moment. It cut cross-country travel time from months down to about a week. Opened up the West like never before for farmers, ranchers, businesses. Eventually, several more transcontinental lines were built, most with government help.
And this easier travel, plus the land policies, must have spurred even more migration after the war.
Big time. People were drawn by the reports, the railroad ads, the promise of land, though farming the Great Plains, as many found out, was a lot tougher than farming back east. Different climate, different soil.
The U.S. also expanded geographically during this time too, right? Alaska?
Yep. Bought Alaska from Russia in 1867. A huge chunk of land, though maybe not part of the frontier in the same way people thought about the contiguous West at the time. Later, you had events like the Oklahoma Land Rush in 1889, another dramatic symbol of settlement.
It feels almost impossible to talk about the frontier without getting into the Indian Wars. It seems like conflict was just endemic.
It's a very difficult and tragic part of the story, absolutely. Even before the big push west of the Mississippi, there were major conflicts back east. The British often supported native tribes after the Revolution, hoping for that buffer state. The War of 1812 was key there. After the U.S. won, many tribes were displaced. Some went to Canada or Florida. Then you had the Seminole Wars in Florida, resisting removal.
And west of the Mississippi, the dynamic changed.
Yeah. You often had native warriors using traditional tactics against a U.S. army that had forts, better logistics, the telegraph, eventually railroads. The sheer numbers, the resources, the odds were stacked against sustained native resistance.
Though some tribes tried to stay out of it.
Some did, or even allied with the U.S. Army as scouts. But the tribes that fought back faced incredible challenges.
We hear about famous conflicts like the Apache Wars, the Great Sioux War.
Right. The Apache Wars were long and brutal, involving figures like Kit Carson forcing relocations and leaders like Geronimo leading fierce resistance into the 1880s. The Great Sioux War of 1876 is probably the most famous.
That included Little Bighorn.
Yes. It started partly because gold was found in the Black Hills, violating the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty with the Lakota Sioux. Leaders like Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse resisted. Little Bighorn was a major native victory over Custer, but ultimately, the war ended in defeat for the Sioux.
Other major conflicts.
The Nez Perce War in 1877, with Chief Joseph's incredible retreat, the Ute Wars in Colorado and Utah. Conflict wasn't a single event, but a long, drawn-out process across the West.
And the Army forts were central to all this.
They were crucial. They moved west with the settlement line, served as bases for troops, projected federal power. They were there to control native populations, protect settlers, guard reservations, secure rail lines. Fort Laramie, Fort Bowie, Fort Sill, dozens of them were key strategic points.
Which leads to the reservation system. What was the idea behind that?
The official policy shifted towards confining tribes to specific areas' reservations. The stated goals were often about separating natives from settlers and pushing assimilation, trying to get native people to adopt white American ways of life, farming, Christianity, etc.
Through treaties.
Treaties were used to set boundaries, like at Fort Laramie. But these treaties were often broken, land was taken, promises weren't kept, settlers encroached. Attitudes in the government and among settlers range wildly from outright hostility to misguided paternalism, rarely genuine partnership.
And it was hard to enforce on nomadic tribes.
Very difficult. And many tribes didn't have the kind of centralized leadership the U.S. government wanted to deal with. So conflicts over land, resources, livestock raiding, treaty violations, they were constant and often violent.
Let's pivot a bit to the social history. It wasn't all just conflict and land grabs. What kind of society was forming?
Well, some historians saw the frontier, like early Kansas, as sort of the essence of American democracy and individualism. Becker called it American spirit double distilled. There's debate about that, of course. But you also had the urban frontier, towns like Denver or Butte growing incredibly fast.
From mining camps to cities.
Yeah, Denver started with mining, then railroads, trade, manufacturing made it boom. Rapid growth, fancy opera houses, but also poverty, crime, saloons, gambling dens, notorious red light districts. But Montana was a huge mining camp, very ethnic, lots of Irish Catholics. These places were complex urban centers, not just dusty outposts.
And the diversity out west that Often gets overlooked in the cowboy myths, doesn't it?
Massively overlooked. You had immigrants from all over Europe forming communities: Finns, Scandinavians, Irish, Germans, English Mormons, German Jews. You had significant African-American populations, figures like Stagecoach Mary Fields or Clara Brown, facing prejudice but achieving amazing things.
Asian immigrants, too.
Absolutely. Chinese immigrants were crucial for building the railroads, but faced terrible discrimination. And of course, you had large Hispanic populations, especially in the territories taken from Mexico, who became U.S. citizens and fought to maintain their culture and rights against discrimination. Figures like Joaquin Murrieta became symbols of resistance for some.
What about family life? Must have been incredibly demanding.
Especially on the farms and ranches of the plains, it required intense labor from everyone: wives, children. Women's roles were absolutely critical for survival, especially early on.
Did that change over time?
Somewhat. As things got a bit more settled, maybe some conveniences arrived, you see a shift towards more defined domestic roles, influenced by ideas from the East. But even with the hardship and isolation, rural communities built strong social networks: barn raisings, church events, school functions, visiting neighbors.
And childhood. Was it idyllic or harsh?
Historians debate that. Some see the benefits of rural life, others focus on loneliness, hard labor, lack of schooling. Probably a mix of both, depending on the family and location.
Okay, what about the more Wild West aspects? Gambling, prostitution, were they as common as the story suggests?
They were definitely present. Gambling halls were often among the first and biggest buildings in new camps or towns. They were major social centers and economic engines. Cattle towns, especially, were magnets for gambling when cowboys arrived with months of wages. That certainly contributed to the wild reputation.
Which brings us to law and order. Was it really that lawless?
It varied a lot. On really remote frontiers, yeah, crime happened and catching criminals was tough. Banditry existed, targeting wagons, sometimes stagecoaches, occasionally banks. Outlaw gangs like the James Younger Gang were real.
But maybe not constant chaos everywhere.
Probably not. Research on cattle towns like Dodge City suggests the violence level, while certainly higher than back east, is often exaggerated in movies. Many towns passed strict gun control laws banning concealed carry or even open carry within town limits precisely to reduce violence. Dodge City and Tombstone both did this.
Ah, Tombstone. That brings up the OK Corral. So those famous gunfights did happen.
Oh, they happened. Tombstone was a turbulent silver mining town. The Earps were lawmen there. They clashed with a faction known as the Cowboys. The gunfight itself and the vendetta ride afterwards are real historical events, though heavily mythologized.
And range wars. Feuds over land.
Those were definitely real, too. Conflicts over control of open-range grazing land and water rights. The Johnson County War in Wyoming is a famous example. Sometimes it involved vigilante groups, sometimes even the Army had to step in. You also had conflicts over ethnic or political tensions, like the Lincoln County War involving Billy the Kid.
And the cattle industry itself, so iconic. How did that whole open-range system work and end?
Well, the destruction of the bison herds opened up vast grasslands. The cattle industry exploded after the Civil War based on huge herds of Texas longhorns.
The cattle drives, yeah.
Yep, driving millions of cattle north from Texas to railroad towns in Kansas, Abilene, Dodge City, Wichita, along trails like the Chisholm Trail. That's where they were shipped east to markets.
Tough work.
Incredibly tough, dangerous, but potentially very profitable. There was even a big investment bubble, lots of British money poured in. But then the terrible winter of 1886-87 killed vast numbers of cattle. That, plus the spread of barbed wire fencing by farmers, basically ended the open range era.
Barbed wire changed everything.
Completely. Led to fence wars as ranchers and farmers fought over land and water access.
And those cow towns themselves, they didn't last long as cattle centers.
Often not. They had these boom and bust cycles, maybe 5 years or so, as the railroads and trails pushed further west. Speculators built them fast. Many eventually settled down into quieter farming towns.
As the frontier era closes, you also see the start of conservation movements, people realizing the landscape was changing.
Exactly. By the 1890s, good, easily farmed land was getting harder to find. Some farmers even moved up to Canada. The Homestead Act, the railroads, barbed wire, they all contributed to closing the frontier.
And statehood marked an endpoint.
For many historians, yes. Oklahoma in 1907, Arizona and New Mexico in 1912, admitting the last contiguous territories felt like the end of that era. Though, some frontier aspects continued. But you also see growing concern about resource depletion the buffalo almost wiped out. That leads to early conservation efforts.
Like Yellowstone.
Yellowstone National Park, established way back in 1872, was a landmark. Figures like George Perkins Marsh, John Muir, and later Teddy Roosevelt became important voices pushing for conservation.
It's amazing how much the frontier still shapes popular culture and our idea of America. How did that whole mythology get started?
It started pretty early. Mid-19th century, you have minstrel shows, popular songs. P.T. Barnum had Wild West exhibits. But the big thing was dime novels, starting around 1859.
Cheap, sensational stories.
Exactly. They cranked out millions, often very formulaic heroic cowboys, savage Indians, noble lawmen, evil outlaws. They created and reinforced a lot of stereotypes that are still with us. Guys like Ned Buntline made Buffalo Bill famous through these stories.
And that image carried into the 20th century.
Oh, yeah. Teddy Roosevelt wrote about his own Western experiences, adding to the mystique. Railroads promoted tourism out west, showing off the national parks. Wild West shows influenced rodeo. And then, of course, Western movies became huge.
John Wayne.
John Ford, John Wayne, they defined the cowboy hero for generations. Though portrayals have changed over time, becoming more critical, questioning those old myths.
What about the Code of the West? Was that a real thing?
It's more of a romantic ideal, an unwritten code emphasizing things like individualism, self-reliance, hospitality, courage, honesty, protecting women. How much it was actually practiced is debatable, but it captured certain values people associated with frontier life. It connects a bit to Southern honor culture, too, and it sometimes justified frontier justice, vigilantism, lynching.
Finally, how have historians' views of the frontier changed? Started with Turner's thesis.
Right. Frederick Jackson Turner in 1893 argued the frontier experience was the key factor in shaping American democracy and identity. That idea dominated for a long time.
But it's been challenged.
Significantly. Starting in the late 20th century, the new Western history movement emerged. They offered a more critical view, emphasizing conquest, conflict over race, class, gender, environment, the role of the federal government, the diversity of people involved, and the environmental consequences.
So focusing more on the complexities and downsides.
And on the voices that Turner often overlooked, Native Americans, Hispanics, women, Asian immigrants, workers. It's about understanding the West as a place of convergence and conflict, not just triumphant expansion.
It's really clear then that the story of the American frontier is so much richer and frankly more complicated than those simple myths we often see. It was a time of massive change with effects that still linger.
Absolutely. That frontier myth is powerful in American culture, no doubt. But it's so important to look past the romance and grapple with the real complexities, the diverse people, the conflicts, the huge social and environmental shifts that really define the era.
So maybe here's a final thought for you, the listener, to mull over. Think about those classic frontier ideals: independence, grit, opportunity, self-reliance. How do those ideals square up or maybe clash with American life today? And beyond the familiar cowboy stories, what parts of this really complex, multifaceted history do you think we need to understand better now? Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're tackling miracles. Those events that seem to just punch a hole right through our usual understanding of how the world works, often chalked up to something, well, supernatural.
Absolutely. And, while we often think of these really dramatic, head-turning things, the term also gets used, maybe more loosely, for just incredible luck or something wonderfully unexpected.
Yeah, like a medical recovery that doctors are just scratching their heads over, or even, I don't know, a perfectly timed coincidence that feels significant.
Exactly. Those moments.
So our deep dive today is all about unpacking this really complex idea of miracles. We've got a fascinating set of perspectives here.
Yep.
From scientific attempts to find natural explanations for what seems impossible,
Right.
to deeply rooted religious beliefs and some really intriguing philosophical head-scratchers, too.
Yeah, there's a lot there.
Our mission, really, is to try and cut through some of the noise and get to the heart of what a miracle truly means, or, could mean.
And what's immediately striking, I think, is just how differently people come at this. We'll see how science, philosophy, and faith each offer their own kind of unique lens for trying to understand these extraordinary events.
Okay, so let's kick things off by trying to pin down the core definition. What exactly is a miracle? At its most basic level, it seems to be an event that, well, science and our understanding of natural laws just can't account for.
Right. It feels like the universe sort of momentarily suspended its own rules.
Exact.
And that feeling, that sense of broken rules, often points towards a supernatural cause, doesn't it? Some kind of divine intervention.
Hmm.
Theologian Wayne Grudem, he offers a more specific take. He defines a miracle as a less common activity of God that, evokes awe and serves as a kind of testament to God himself.
Which then brings up that deistic viewpoint, right? If you
Yeah.
believe God sort of created the universe, set it in motion, but doesn't usually step in.
Like the clockmaker idea.
Yeah, exactly, the clockmaker.
Yeah.
Then a miracle would be this pretty unusual direct act of divine involvement, like God reaching in to tweak a gear he doesn't normally touch.
That image really captures it. But then we have to consider, well, could these seemingly miraculous events actually have perfectly natural explanations? Maybe ones we just don't know yet.
That's the flip side.
Yeah, one angle suggests that some miracle claims might just be, bad information. Or maybe stories that got embellished over time, fictionalized.
Or even just mistakes in how we perceive things,
Yeah.
our own minds playing tricks.
Totally. Cognitive errors, psychological factors like hallucinations, maybe even just overthinking coincidences. Our perception isn't always the most reliable witness.
Definitely not. And then there's this idea you mentioned, this law of truly large numbers. Can you break that down for us? It sounds a bit intimidating.
It does sound mathematical, but the implications are really interesting for this topic. Essentially, this law, and there's also something related called Littlewood's law, it tells us that when you have a huge number of opportunities for something to happen,
Okay.
even incredibly unlikely events become, well, almost expected to occur eventually. It's not supernatural intervention. It's just the sheer scale of possibilities.
So give me an example.
Okay, think about this. 3 people who went to the same small elementary school, like decades ago, randomly bump into each other in a tiny cafe on the complete opposite side of the world.
Wow, okay. That feels miraculous.
It feels like a 1 in a million chance, right? But when you factor in billions of people, countless interactions happening globally every single second, these kinds of coincidences, while rare for the individuals, become statistically less astonishing overall. They're almost predictable anomalies within a massive data set.
So what feels like this incredibly personal, maybe divine wink,
Yeah.
might just be probability playing out on a grand scale. That definitely takes some of the mystery out, but it's also kind of amazing in its own right, the scale of it all.
It is. It shifts the perspective.
Okay, now let's pivot a bit to the philosophical side. How have thinkers, throughout history, grappled with this idea of miracles?
Oh, philosophers have been wrestling with this for ages. Let's maybe start with Aristotle and the Neo-Aristotelians. They saw God as pure actuality, the ultimate source of motion and change, but primarily as a being of pure thought.
Okay.
Influential Jewish philosophers like Maimonides later integrated these ideas. So the emphasis isn't so much on God constantly intervening, but more on God's primary activity being, well, contemplation.
A God more focused on thinking than tinkering with the world day to day.
That's one way to think about it, yeah. Then you have someone like Baruch Spinoza who offered a really different perspective. He argued that miracles aren't actual violations of natural law.
Oh, so what are they then?
He thought they were just events following natural laws that we simply haven't figured out yet. So for Spinoza, calling something a miracle is often just admitting our own ignorance at that moment. It's like saying, wow, no idea how that happened.
Huh. So for Spinoza, a future scientific breakthrough could potentially just turn yesterday's miracle into today's understandable phenomenon.
Exactly. That's the implication. Now, David Hume's take is, well, it's hugely influential here. He defined a miracle pretty clearly as a transgression of a law of nature by a particular volition of the deity or by the interposition of some invisible agent.
Okay, that sounds like the standard definition.
It is, but his big point was about evidence. He argued that the evidence we have for the consistent, reliable operation of natural laws based on countless observations is always going to be stronger, more probable than the evidence for a miracle.
Why is that?
Because miracle evidence usually relies on testimony, right? Eyewitness accounts. And Hume argued that testimony can be flawed, people can be mistaken, or they might even be lying. He famously said it's always more probable that the testimony is false than that a law of nature has actually been broken.
That's a really powerful point. I mean, our entire understanding of reality is built on the bedrock of these natural laws working consistently.
Precisely.
So to believe a miracle happened, the evidence for that specific event would have to be unbelievably strong, strong enough to outweigh all our experience of nature's regularity.
Exactly. It sets a very high bar for evidence. Then you get Friedrich Schleiermacher, who comes along with a more personal, maybe faith-based view. He suggested that any event can become a miracle if you view it through a dominant religious lens.
So it's less about the event itself objectively defying nature.
And more about how it's interpreted within a framework of faith.
Yeah, like the same sunrise could be just a routine astronomical event for one person and a profound daily miracle of creation for another.
Exactly that. It's about the meaning that's ascribed to it. Then there's Søren Kierkegaard. He actually agreed with Hume's definition, a miracle is a break in natural law, but he added another layer of, well, doubt.
Oh, no, so.
He pointed out that all historical reports, including reports of miracles, are inherently less than certain. We weren't there. We're relying on stories, transmission. There's always a degree of uncertainty about anything historical.
Which makes it even tougher to be absolutely certain about a specific miracle reported from the past.
Right. And then James Keller raises a really interesting ethical question. He argued that if God performs miracles, but only for some people and not others, well, couldn't that be seen as inherently unfair?
Yeah, the question of why one person gets a miraculous healing while countless others suffer.
It's a tough moral dilemma that often comes up in these discussions about divine intervention. Now, maybe shifting from these philosophical angles, let's dive into how different religions actually view miracles. Because it's clear that belief and interpretation vary hugely.
Absolutely. Like, I remember seeing a stat, I think it was a 2011 Pew Research poll in the U.S., finding that something like over 90% of evangelical Christians believe miracles still happen today. That's a very strong affirmation.
It really is. And if you compare that, say, to common Islamic views, there's a slightly different nuance. In Islam, Allah is generally seen as the direct cause of everything. So miracles aren't necessarily seen as God breaking rules he set up, but more like direct, perhaps more obvious manifestations of God's power, which is constantly active anyway. It's less about disrupting the order and more about God showing his hand directly.
Interesting. That's a more integrated view, maybe. Seeing the miraculous as part of God's continuous action rather than an exception. Now, what about Buddhism? How does this concept fit there?
Well, in Buddhism, the focus is often more on spiritual liberation, enlightenment, and miracles tend to be viewed within that context. There's a really compelling, dramatic story about Ikkedon in 6th century Korea.
Yeah.
He apparently orchestrated his own martyrdom, predicting that a miracle would happen when he died to prove the truth of Buddhism and convince the royal court to adopt it.
Wow. That's quite a tragedy.
Right.
What was the supposed miracle then?
Well, the legend says that when his head was cut off, the earth shook, the sun went dark, flowers rained down from the sky, his severed head flew off to a sacred mountain, and get this, milk, not blood, flowed from his neck.
Milk instead of blood. Okay, that is dramatic. And it worked.
Supposedly, this convinced the court, and Buddhism became the state religion. It's a powerful foundation story.
Incredible. Are there other examples of miracles in Buddhist tradition?
Oh, yes. There's a collection in Japan, the Honshu Hakkare Genki, full of traditional Buddhist miracle stories. And miracles also play a really significant role in the veneration of Buddhist relics.
Like how?
Well, take the Samawati Stupa in Sri Lanka. It's a major pilgrimage site, and there are numerous accounts, even photos and videos apparently, of unexplained lights, beams, maybe apparitions seen around the stupa, especially on religious days. These events reinforce faith and draw huge crowds.
So miracles acting as like focal points for devotion and community. Okay, let's turn to Christianity now. Miracles seem pretty foundational there, especially in the stories about Jesus.
Absolutely central. The Gospels are just packed with accounts of Jesus performing miracles. They generally fall into three main types: exorcisms driving out demons, cures or healings, and what you might call natural wonders calming storms, walking on water, feeding the 5,000.
Right.
And interestingly, in the Gospel of John, these acts are often called signs. Not just miracles, but signs, which emphasizes their purpose, pointing towards Jesus' divine identity and showing God's activity in the world in these remarkable ways.
And the biggest one, of course.
The resurrection of Jesus. That's the absolute cornerstone miracle of Christian belief.
And Jesus himself talks about the power of faith being linked to these acts, doesn't he? The mustard seed analogy.
He does. He famously says that faith, even as small as a mustard seed, could move mountains. And then in the book of Acts, you see the disciples continuing to perform miracles in Jesus' name after his ascension. It suggests this power wasn't, just limited to Jesus himself.
But the New Testament isn't all positive about extraordinary events, is it? There are also warnings about deception.
That's a really crucial point, yeah. There are passages, especially in Matthew and Thessalonians and Revelation, that explicitly warn about false prophets and false messiahs who will perform impressive signs and wonders.
To mislead people.
Exactly. To deceive, it says, even the elect, if that were possible. So these are often called pseudo-miracles, highlighting their deceptive nature, distinguishing them from what's seen as genuine divine work. It underlines the need for discernment, even within a faith context.
It's fascinating that even within the foundational texts, there's this built-in caution. Don't just blindly accept every amazing thing you see.
Right, it adds complexity.
What role did miracle stories play in the early spread of Christianity, particularly among non-Jews?
This seemed to have been really important. Miracles were frequently presented as key evidence in converting pagans in the early centuries. Remember, the Greco-Roman world generally accepted the possibility of supernatural events. So Christian writers used their miracle stories, healings, exorcisms, power over nature, as proof that their God was uniquely powerful and authoritative. Eusebius, the historian, even attributes the apostles' success largely to their miracle-working abilities.
But then, as we move into the Enlightenment, the Age of Reason, did Christian views on miracles start to shift or face challenges?
Definitely. There was a growing pressure to reconcile faith with emerging scientific understanding. Thinkers like C.S. Lewis, much later of course, argued for the logical possibility of miracles, suggesting they weren't necessarily violations of nature, but maybe interventions from a higher reality into ours.
Like his example of the virgin birth.
Exactly. He argued it wasn't nature doing something impossible for nature, but God introducing something entirely new into nature. Others offered more naturalistic interpretations for some of Jesus's healings, proposing they might have addressed things we'd now call psychosomatic illnesses, or perhaps their main function was social, restoring someone considered unclean, like a leper, back into the community.
So different ways of understanding those ancient stories in a more modern context.
Yeah.
And it seems even today, different Christian groups place different emphasis on miracles, right?
That's very true. While belief in miracles exists across most traditions, it's particularly prominent, you could say, in Roman Catholicism and especially in Pentecostal and charismatic churches. That's where you hear more contemporary claims of things like faith healings, exorcisms, maybe speaking in tongues, things like that.
Let's zoom in on the Catholic Church first. They seem to have a very structured, almost legalistic process for officially recognizing miracles, don't they? It's not just accepting any claim.
Absolutely not. The Catholic Church views miracles as tangible works of God, either performed directly or through the prayers, the intercession of saints. And these miracles are often seen as having a specific purpose, maybe a sign or an answer to prayer.
And the process for validating them?
It's rigorous. It's overseen by a specific department in the Vatican, the Congregation for the Causes of Saints. They investigate claims very carefully, looking for medical proof, ruling out natural explanation.
And the bar is pretty high, I gather.
Extremely high. For instance, for someone to be canonized, declared a saint, the Church generally requires proof of 2 posthumous miracles attributed to their intercession, miracles that happened after their death through people praying to them.
Like with Pope John Paul II, wasn't there a specific miracle linked to his beatification?
Yes, the case of Marie Simon-Pierre, a French nun whose recovery from Parkinson's disease after praying to John Paul II was investigated and officially recognized by the Church as medically inexplicable and thus miraculous.
Are there other famous examples of church-approved miracles?
Oh, there are many down the centuries. You have Eucharistic miracles, where the consecrated bread and wine are believed to have physically changed into flesh and blood. Famous ones are Lanciano and Santarem. There's the alleged miraculous restoration of a man's severed leg in Spain in 1640. And perhaps the most famous 20th century one is the Miracle of the Sun at Fatima, Portugal in 1917.
Right, where thousands of people reported seeing the sun dance or spin or change colors.
Exactly. Along with other phenomena like sudden heat and the ground drying instantly after rain. Then there are Marian apparitions, like at Velankani in India, associated with multiple attributed miracles, healings, rescues.
But is belief in these specific miracles, the ones outside the Bible, actually required for Catholics?
No, it's not. While the Church investigates carefully and may approve certain events as miraculous after ruling out natural causes, belief in these specific extra-scriptural miracles is not considered necessary for salvation. It's a matter of private devotion, really.
Okay. And did Catholic thinkers try to categorize miracles?
Yes. Thomas Aquinas, a hugely important theologian, did. In his Summa contra Gentile, he outlined 3 types. First, things God does that nature could never do, like making the sun go backward. Second, things God does that nature can do, but not in that specific way, or order, like restoring sight to the blind or life to the dead instantly. And third, things God does that nature usually does, but God does it without using the normal natural processes, like healing a fever instantly by divine will, or making it rain without atmospheric causes.
That's a helpful framework.
Okay.
Okay, now how about evangelicals? We mentioned the high belief rate earlier. How do they typically view miracles in contemporary life?
For many evangelical Christians, there's a strong emphasis on biblicism of the Bible as the direct authoritative word of God. So the miracles described in the Bible aren't just ancient history, they're seen as real events and, crucially, as models for what God can and still does today.
So they expect miracles to continue.
Yes, very much so. They often see modern-day occurrences, maybe unexpected healings, financial provision, finding a job against the odds, overcoming addiction as tangible evidence of God's ongoing miraculous intervention in believers' lives. This is often linked to faith, prayer, and the power of the Holy Spirit.
And this became even more prominent recently.
Well, the neo-charismatic movement, starting around the 1980s, really brought a renewed emphasis on the signs and wonders, including miracles and especially faith healing. Practices like the laying on of hands for healing became much more widespread in many churches. There's often a strong belief that divine healing is part of the inheritance believers receive through Jesus' death and resurrection.
Okay, shifting gears again, Hinduism. How do miracles feature in that tradition, which is so diverse itself?
In Hinduism, the emphasis tends to be more on spiritual liberation, achieving moksha, rather than, say, physical miracles as proof of divinity. A key example often cited isn't a physical healing, but Krishna revealing his true, awe-inspiring cosmic form to Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita. That's a miracle of divine vision and understanding.
So more about spiritual realization.
Often, yes. While Hindu scriptures and epics contain many stories of gods and sages performing wondrous feats, there's also sometimes a caution from Hindu sages against expecting or seeking external miracles without putting in the necessary spiritual effort and discipline yourself.
Interesting. What about more modern examples? I think I heard about something with milk.
Ah, yes, the Hindu milk miracle. That was huge back in 1995, and it's apparently recurred occasionally since. Statues of Hindu deities, particularly Ganesh, were reported across India and even worldwide to be drinking milk offered to them by devotees.
Drinking milk. How?
Well, scientifically, the explanation offered was capillary action, the porous material of the statues drawing the milk up, creating the appearance of drinking. But for many believers, it was a powerful sign, a genuine miracle. It really highlights that tension again, doesn't it, between faith-based interpretation and potential natural explanations.
It certainly does. That tension seems central to this whole topic. Now let's explore the Islamic understanding. We touched on it briefly.
Right. In Islam, as we said, a miracle is generally understood as a supernatural intervention by Allah in human affairs. The Quran itself is considered the greatest miracle. Miracles function in sort of a threefold sense within sacred history, like the miracles of previous prophets, specifically connected to the Prophet Muhammad, and supremely in the revelation of the Quran.
And you mentioned they use a different word.
Yes, the Quran typically uses the word ayah, which translates more closely to sign or evidence, rather than a technical Arabic term for a miracle like mujiza. And ayah has multiple meanings. It can refer to the verses of the Quran themselves, the miraculous nature of the Quran as a whole, and also signs within creation, like the complexity of nature that point to God's existence and power.
And there was that interesting theological view you mentioned, occasionalism.
Ah, yes. Some influential medieval Muslim theologians, like Al-Ghazali, proposed this idea of occasionalism. They rejected the idea of inherent cause and effect in nature. Instead, they argued that God is constantly, moment by moment, recreating the universe and all its atoms. So what we perceive as natural laws are really just God's customary way of acting, his sunnah.
So under that view, a miracle isn't God breaking his own laws.
Exactly. It's just God choosing to act in a less customary way for a particular moment. It makes divine intervention seem less like an exception and more like a constant possibility within God's direct governance of everything. And separate from theology, Sufi biographical literature is also filled with accounts of saints possessing miraculous abilities, clairvoyance, invisibility, traveling vast distances instantly, producing food, healing, and so on.
Okay, fascinating. Finally, let's turn to Judaism. How are miracles viewed within Jewish tradition and history?
Descriptions of miracles, called nes in Hebrew, meaning miracle or sign, appear throughout the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible. You have classic examples involving the prophets, like Elijah raising a widow's son from the dead, or Elisha performing various wonders like multiplying oil.
And, of course, the Exodus story.
Absolutely. The entire Exodus narrative is built around miracles associated with Moses, the 10 plagues in Egypt, the parting of the Red Sea, manna from heaven in the desert. These are foundational. Later, around the 1st century BCE, there was an emergence of Jewish figures known as miracle workers, acting kind of in the tradition of the earlier prophets. A famous example from the Talmud is Honi Hamagal, who was known for successfully praying for rain during a drought.
And in more recent Jewish thought,
Well, Rebbe Nachman of Breslov, a major figure in Hasidism from the late 18th, early 19th century, had an interesting perspective. He taught that the tendency people have to try and explain away miracles with natural explanations is actually a kind of spiritual test, and this obscuring of the miraculous would cease before the ultimate redemption, before the Mashiach comes. He really emphasized the importance of pure faith.
and is belief in miracles still strong in some Jewish communities today?
Very much so, particularly within Hasidic communities. Stories of miracles are quite prevalent. They're often linked to having a close personal connection, a yechidut, with a righteous leader, a tzaddik, or rebbe. You hear stories of barren women conceiving after receiving a blessing, people experiencing remission from serious illnesses, finding solutions to difficult problems.
And there's something about leftovers.
Ah, yes, the shreim. There's a Hasidic belief that partaking of the food left over from the Rebbe's meal can itself be a source of blessing and even miracles. It's tied to the sanctity attributed to the Rebbe.
It's truly remarkable, isn't it? Just how deeply woven the idea of miracles is into the fabric of so many different religious traditions, each with its own unique stories, interpretations, emphasis.
It really is, but it's also undeniable that the whole concept of miracles has faced considerable skepticism and outright criticism, especially since the Enlightenment.
Absolutely. Let's touch on some of that criticism. Who are some key figures challenging the idea?
Well, you have figures like Thomas Paine, the American Revolutionary writer. He was pretty blunt, famously dismissing biblical miracles as just tales that resemble each other like the scraps from a tailor's shop, basically formulaic and unbelievable.
Strong words. And Thomas Jefferson.
Jefferson went even further in a practical sense. He actually created his own edited version of the Gospels known as the Jefferson Bible. He physically cut out all the supernatural bits, the miracles, the resurrection, the divinity claims.
Really?
He wanted to rescue what he saw as the core, rational, benevolent, moral teachings of Jesus from what he called the artificial systems, things like the virgin birth and miraculous powers, which he believed were later additions or corruptions that made Jesus seem like an imposter.
Wow. And others shared that skepticism.
Oh, definitely. Ethan Allen, another figure from the American Revolution, put it starkly, "Where learning and science abound, miracles cease." The implication being that miracles are basically a product of ignorance.
That's a common thread in the criticism.
It is. Robert Ingersoll, a very prominent 19th century agnostic orator, made an interesting historical point. He observed that belief in Christ's miracles wasn't actually that widespread initially, arguing it grew over time through repetition and faith, rather than being based on overwhelming immediate evidence.
Kind of questioning the original accounts.
Exactly. And Elbert Hubbard had that witty, cynical definition. A miracle is simply an event described by those to whom it was told by people who did not see it. In other words, secondhand hearsay.
That's quite pointed. Any more recent critiques?
Well, Richard Dawkins, the evolutionary biologist and prominent atheist, frequently criticizes belief in miracles as a subversion of Occam's razor, the principle that you should favor the simplest explanation. He argues that postulating a supernatural intervention is almost always a more complex and less probable explanation than seeking a natural one, even if it's currently unknown.
So invoking the supernatural is seen as an unnecessary complication.
Pretty much. And interestingly, even some religious thinkers raised objections. Baden-Powell, who was both a mathematician and an Anglican priest in the 19th century, argued that miracles would actually involve God breaking the very laws he himself established at creation. Powell saw this as inconsistent and, paradoxically, almost atheistic, because it implied a God who contradicts his own nature and order.
That's a fascinating argument from within a religious framework itself. Okay, this has been a really sweeping journey, hasn't it? Exploring this whole landscape of ideas about miracles, from, potentially natural coincidences explained by probability.
Right, all the way to profound religious events seen as direct divine acts, and then these intense philosophical debates about possibility, evidence, and fairness.
It's just so clear that how we define a miracle, how we interpret an extraordinary event, and whether we ultimately believe in them, it's deeply personal, isn't it? And it's shaped by so many factors: our culture, our upbringing, our worldview.
It really highlights that fundamental point. Our basic assumptions about reality heavily influence how we perceive and explain the extraordinary. What one person dismisses as a random fluke, another might cherish as a deeply meaningful sign of divine intervention. There's rarely universal agreement.
So as we bring this deep dive to a close, maybe here's a final thought for you, the listener, to mull over. Considering this incredible range of explanations and beliefs we've touched on today, from the statistical likelihood of the unlikely, to philosophical skepticism, to the deep faith traditions, what personal criteria do you use? How do you decide whether something might be a miracle? Or how do you even consider that possibility in your own life or when looking at the world around you?
Yeah, that's a question that really gets to the heart of how we each make sense of the unexpected, the unexplained.
Definitely something to think about. Thanks for diving deep with us today.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling something, well, absolutely fundamental, the very stuff everything around us is made of. Molecules. And you, our listener, are probably looking for a clear, efficient way to grasp this key concept, right? Without getting totally bogged down in technical jargon.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Think of this as your shortcut to understanding the molecular world.
So we've basically sifted through the Wikipedia page on molecule.
We have, and we're aiming to pull out the really important bits, the intriguing aspects, what defines a molecule, a bit of its history, why it matters.
But keeping it accessible.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Hopefully sparking some aha moments along the way.
Okay, let's get straight to the core then. What is a molecule in its most basic sense?
Well, at its heart, it's a group of two or more atoms, and they're held together by these attractive forces we call chemical bonds.
Like tiny building blocks linked up?
Exactly. Now, there is a bit of nuance here. We usually think of molecules as electrically neutral, right? But in certain fields, think quantum physics, organic chemistry, biochemistry, the term, can sometimes stretch to include polyatomic ions.
Ions, so charged particles.
Right. Imagine that group of building blocks, but it's gained or lost a tiny electrical charge. That's basically a polyatomic ion. So sometimes it gets called a charged molecule in those contexts.
Huh. So not always neutral. That's actually a really interesting starting point. And are there different kinds of these atomic groupings?
No, absolutely. We can make a distinction. There are homonuclear molecules. These contain atoms of only one element.
Like oxygen, O2.
Perfect example, the oxygen we breathe.
Yeah.
Then you have heteronuclear molecules. These are basically chemical compounds made up of more than one type of element.
Water, H2O.
Classic example.
Okay, one type of element versus many. Okay, makes sense. Now, I noticed something in our sources about gases. The definition seemed a bit different there.
Yes. Good point. When we talk about the kinetic theory of gases, the term molecule kind of broadens out. In that context, it's often used for any individual particle moving around in the gas. Doesn't really matter if it's multiple atoms bonded together or just a single atom on its own.
So even like a lone helium atom.
Yeah, even noble gas atoms like helium or neon, which don't usually form bonds. For that theory, what matters is the particle bumping around, creating pressure.
Right, the individual thing moving.
Exactly. So whether it's one atom or a group, the physics they're looking at in that specific context isn't fundamentally changed.
So in that specific case, a single helium atom gets the molecule label. Okay, that's kind of a twist. What about things held together by weaker connections then? Are those molecules?
That's a really key distinction. Generally, no. Atoms or groups of atoms connected by weaker, non-covalent interactions.
Like hydrogen bonds or ionic bonds.
Exactly. Those are generally not considered single molecules in the, let's say, typical chemical sense. Think about water H2O itself as a molecule.
Right.
But the way water molecules stick together through hydrogen bonds, that network they form isn't considered one giant supermolecule. And similarly, like a crystal of salt, sodium chloride, it's held together by ionic bonds in this repeating pattern. We don't think of that solid as being made of individual NaCl molecules.
Okay, that really helps clarify where the boundaries are usually drawn. Now, this idea of a molecule, it wasn't always around like this, was it?
Not at all.
Let's maybe dig into how the concept developed.
Yeah, it's a fascinating history. Our modern understanding took centuries, but the seeds of the idea go way, way back.
Like ancient Greece.
You got it. Philosophers like Leucippus and Democritus, back in the 5th century BC, they were already talking about indivisible particles, atoms moving in empty space.
And Empedocles, with the four elements: fire, earth, air, water.
Right. He proposed those elements plus forces of attraction and repulsion that let them mix and interact. Very early ideas about fundamental components.
It's amazing, isn't it? Even without the science we have now, they were thinking about matter being made of smaller bits.
It really is. Then fast forward a bit. Robert Boyle, in 1661, he hypothesized matter was made of clusters of particles, and chemical changes were rearrangements of these clusters.
Getting closer.
Definitely. Then William Higgins, in 1789, talked about combinations of ultimate particles. This really foreshadowed the idea of valency. How atoms have a certain capacity to connect with others.
Okay, so the picture is gradually coming into focus. When did the actual word molecule appear?
The credit for that usually goes to Amedeo Avogadro.
Avogadro. I remember that name from science class.
Yeah, big one. In his 1811 paper, he essentially proposed that the smallest particles of gases weren't always single atoms. They could be made of a specific number of atoms, united by attraction, to form a single molecule.
That feels like a huge step, distinguishing atoms from these multi-atom units in gases.
It was pivotal, absolutely, for understanding gases properly.
And people started trying to actually picture these things too, right? Not just talk about them theoretically.
Exactly. In 1833, Marc-Antoine Auguste Godin presented these visual representations. He called them volume diagrams.
Early sketches of molecules.
Yeah. Now, they weren't always accurate by today's standards, like he drew water as linear and we know it's bent. But it was significant. Some of the first attempts to really visualize the shapes and formulas, like showing H2O with one oxygen and two hydrogens.
From philosophy to diagrams. That's quite a journey. Okay, let's jump ahead. How did quantum physics change the game? Because that seems like a major turning point.
Oh, completely. It revolutionized everything at the deepest level. Early 20th century scientists realized classical physics just didn't cut it for atoms and subatomic particles.
Things didn't behave as expected.
Not at all. Then in 1926, Jean Perrine won the Nobel Prize for his work on Brownian motion. This gave real, concrete, experimental proof for the existence of atoms and molecules.
Actual proof. It's hard to imagine a time when their existence was still, debated.
It was a massive confirmation. Then, just a year later, 1927, Fritz London and Walter Heitler did something groundbreaking.
What was that?
They applied quantum mechanics to explain the chemical bond in the hydrogen molecule. That work essentially laid the theoretical foundation for understanding how atoms actually stick together.
So, moving beyond just saying attractive forces.
Precisely. Before quantum mechanics, the picture was sort of like electrons orbiting a nucleus, like planets.
The Bohr model, kind of.
Right. But quantum mechanics showed electrons exist in these fuzzy clouds of probability, these orbitals, and that fundamentally changed how we understood atomic interactions and bonding.
And this quantum understanding paved the way for getting into the details, like molecular shape.
Exactly. Building on London and Heitler's work, Linus Pauling, in 1931, published this incredibly influential paper, The Nature of the Chemical Bond.
Pauling, another huge name.
Definitely. He used quantum mechanics to explain why molecules have specific shapes, specific bond angles. He developed the concept of hybridization.
Hybridization, mixing orbitals.
Yeah, basically explaining how atomic orbitals, those electron probability regions, can mix to form new shapes, hybrid orbitals, that are better suited for bonding. Methane, CH4, is the classic example.
Okay.
Carbon's orbitals hybridize to form four identical sober orbitals, pointing toward the corners of a tetrahedron. These then form strong sigma bonds with the four hydrogens. That explains its tetrahedral shape.
Wow. So quantum mechanics gave us the tools to really get why molecules look and behave the way they do. Powerful stuff.
Incredibly powerful.
Now, the source material also talks about the science of molecules. What are the main branches there?
We generally talk about molecular chemistry and molecular physics. Molecular chemistry is mostly about the interactions between molecules forming and breaking bonds, basically chemical reactions.
Okay.
Molecular physics focuses more on the structure and the physical properties of individual molecules.
But I imagine there's overlap.
Oh, absolutely. The line can be pretty blurry in practice. You need to understand structure to understand reactivity and vice versa. They're deeply connected.
Two sides of the same tiny coin, almost. We've talked about stable molecules, but what about the really reactive, short-lived ones?
Right. So fundamentally, a molecule is defined as a stable or bound system of atoms.
Well,
But we also use the term unstable molecule.
for what kind of things?
For species that are very reactive, don't stick around long. Things like radicals, they have unpaired electrons, very reactive.
Okay.
Molecular ions with charges, highly excited molecules called Rydberg molecules, transition states those fleeting structures during a reaction. Even weakly bound things, like van der Waals complexes.
So even those temporary arrangements sometimes get the molecule label, depending on the context.
Exactly. Depends on what you're studying and how you're looking at it.
Makes sense. Now, where do we actually find these molecules? My first thought is just everywhere.
That's largely right. Molecules are incredibly common. Think about the oceans, the atmosphere. Mostly molecules, water, oxygen, nitrogen, CO2.
All molecules.
Yep. And most organic stuff, sugars, plastics, they're molecules. And crucially, the building blocks of life itself.
Proteins, DNA.
Proteins, nucleic acids like DNA and RNA, carbohydrates, fats, vitamins, all molecules, often very big, complex ones, macromolecules.
So life is fundamentally molecular. What about stuff that isn't organic, like minerals?
Ah, that's where we see the difference. Nutrient minerals like iron sulfate, calcium carbonate, they're generally ionic compounds.
So not discrete molecules in their solid form.
Right, they exist as these repeating lattices of ions held by electrostatic attraction, not individual, separate molecules. And lots of other familiar solids, quartz, rocks, metals like iron or copper, they aren't made of molecules either.
They form networks.
Exactly. Large, continuous networks held together by chemical bonds.
So a grain of sand isn't one giant molecule. It's mostly silicon dioxide.
Correct. For things like quartz, silicon dioxide, or diamond carbon network, or salts like sodium chloride, you don't find distinct molecules. You find these repeating unit cell structures extending out, forming these huge lattices.
Like a giant framework.
A good way to put it. And metals, too, with their metallic bonding electrons shared across the whole structure, they aren't made of molecules.
Okay, what about glass? It's solid, but not crystalline.
Good question. Glasses are disordered solids. They have chemical bonds linking the atoms, but they lack both definable molecules and that repeating crystalline structure. It's a different kind of arrangement.
So it sounds like the classic idea of a molecule really fits best for these distinct units, atoms held together by covalent bonds.
That's a pretty good summary. Molecules are generally held together by covalent bonding, where atoms share electron pairs. And lots of non-metallic elements exist naturally as molecules, hydrogen H2, chlorine Cl2, not just single atoms.
And then there's that theoretical debate about whether a whole chunk of metal could be seen as one giant molecule.
Yeah, that perspective does pop up sometimes. The argument is, well, all the atoms are linked by metallic bonds sharing electrons across the whole thing.
But that's not the usual view.
Others argue that metallic bonding, the way those electrons behave collectively, is just fundamentally different from typical molecular bonding in discrete units. It kind of highlights that the definition can be a bit operational. Depends on how you define the bound system.
A fascinating point. It shows even basic concepts have these nuances. Now, we mentioned covalent and ionic bonds. Can we break down what those actually are?
Sure. Covalent bonding, like we said, is about sharing electron pairs between atoms.
Why do they share?
It allows both atoms to achieve a more stable electron configuration, often like a noble gas. The bond itself comes from a balance in the attraction between the positive nuclei and the negative shared electrons versus the repulsion between the two positive nuclei and between the electrons themselves.
So a balance of forces creates the connection.
Exactly. A delicate dance at the atomic level.
And ionic bonding is different. No sharing.
Right. Ionic bonding is all about electrostatic attraction between oppositely charged ions.
How do they get charged?
Typically, one atom, often a metal, loses electrons, becoming a positive ionication. Another atom, usually a nonmetal, gains those electrons, becoming a negative ion, an anion.
And opposites attract.
Strongly. That electrostatic force holds them together. Now, usually ionic compounds form those crystal solids we talked about, no discrete molecules.
But you said.
But if you vaporize them at really high temperatures, they can exist as individual molecules in the gas phase, like sodium chloride pairs, NaCl. The bond still has very strong ionic character because of the big difference in electronegativity between sodium and chlorine.
That's wild. So even salt can be molecular under extreme conditions. State of matter really matters here.
It does.
Okay, let's shift to size. How big are molecules generally? We know they're small, but...
Incredibly small, most of them. Way too small for the naked eye or even normal light microscopes. But there are exceptions.
Macromolecules.
Right. DNA, proteins, some polymers, they can get huge, sometimes even visible with powerful microscopes. But for your typical organic molecules, the building blocks for synthesis or biology, we're usually talking a few to maybe dozens of angstroms.
And an angstrom is?
Tiny. 100 millionth of a centimeter. So a small organic molecule might be, say, 5 to 10 angstroms across.
Wow. Mind-bogglingly small. How do we even see or measure things that tiny?
Well, not with visible light directly. The wavelength is too big.
Yeah.
But we have clever techniques. Atomic force microscopy, AFM.
Okay.
It uses a superfine tip to scan a surface, almost like feeling it at the atomic level. It can give us images of small molecules, sometimes even resolve individual atom outlines. And the smallest molecule is diatomic hydrogen, H2. Just 2 hydrogen atoms. Its bond length is about 0.74 angstroms. We also talk about an effective molecular radius, kind of the size a molecule appears when interacting with others in solution.
So clever ways to probe these tiny things. How do we write them down? Chemical formulas, right?
Exactly. Formulas are the shorthand. Element symbols, number subscripts, showing how many of each atom. H2O, 2 hydrogens, 1 oxygen. That's the molecular formula.
An empirical formula, that's different.
Sometimes. The empirical formula is the simplest whole number ratio of elements. For water, it's also H2O. But take ethanol, its molecular formula is C2H6O. 2 carbons, 6 hydrogens, 1 oxygen.
Okay.
Its empirical formula happens to be the same, C2H6O, because that's already the simplest ratio.
But that ratio doesn't always tell the whole story, does it? Can different molecules have the same formula?
Absolutely. That's where isomers come in. Same atoms, same count, but arranged differently.
Ah.
Ethanol, C2H6O, and dimethyl ether, also C2H6O. Same molecular formula, but the atoms are connected differently. They have totally different properties because of that structure.
So the molecular formula gives the count, but the structure is crucial too.
Totally crucial. Isomers share the formula, but structure dictates behavior. Sometimes, like water, empirical and molecular formulas are the same. Other times, like acetylene, C2H2, the empirical formula is just CH, the 1.1 ratio, but the molecular formula tells you there are actually 2 of each. And for those network solids, the crystals, we use formula unit instead of molecular formula for calculations. Molecular mass comes from the molecular formula. For networks, we talk about formula mass.
And if the molecule is really complex,
Then the formula isn't enough. We need structural formulas, diagrams, showing how atoms are connected, sometimes even in 3D.
visualizing the connections is key. And shape molecules aren't just static blobs, they have definite shapes, right?
Absolutely. They have fixed equilibrium geometries, specific bond lengths, specific bond angles, but they're not rigid.
They move.
Constantly vibrating bonds stretch, bend, twist, and rotating. But that basic geometry, defined by the formula and structure, determines the properties, especially reactivity.
Which is why isomers, same atoms, different arrangement, behave differently.
Exactly. And even stereoisomers, same connections, just different 3D arrangement. They might have similar physical properties but act very differently in biological systems, like how a drug fits a receptor.
Shape dictates function. Wow, how do we study these shapes and movements?
That's molecular spectroscopy. Studying how molecules interact with energy light, microwaves, radio waves.
How does that work?
Molecules have quantized energy levels, discrete steps. They absorb or emit energy, like light, to jump between these levels. By looking at the wavelengths or frequencies they absorb or emit, we learn about their structure, dynamics, even identify them.
It's like listening to their energy changes.
Kind of. Though spectroscopy usually excludes diffraction studies on crystals, which look at the average structure in a large ordered array.
What kinds of spectroscopy are there? What do they tell us?
Several key types. Microwave spectroscopy looks at rotational energy levels, great for identifying molecules, even in space.
Wow.
Infrared, or IR, spectroscopy probes vibrations, bonds, stretching, and bending. It's like a molecular fingerprint, helps identify bonds and functional groups. UVVs and near-infrared look at electron transitions related to color and electronic structure. And NMR, nuclear magnetic resonance, tells us about the environment around specific nuclei, giving details on connectivity.
It's like having a whole toolkit to probe them from different angles.
Exactly. Each technique gives us a different piece of the puzzle.
So finally, let's touch on the theory behind all this. How do we explain molecules theoretically?
It all comes down to quantum mechanics, really. Understanding chemical bonds, electron behavior. You need quantum theory for that deep understanding.
Okay.
The simplest possible molecule is the hydrogen molecule ion, H2 plus cyclium. Just two protons, one electron. Its one electron bond is the simplest chemical bond
Why is that one important?
because it doesn't have electron repulsion, which complicates things in bigger molecules.
Yeah.
So the main equation of quantum mechanics, the Schrödinger equation, is much easier to solve for H2 plus bomb. It's a fundamental starting point.
A testing ground for the theory.
Exactly. And now, with powerful computers, we can approximate solutions for much bigger, more complex molecules. That's computational chemistry predicting and understanding properties.
So how do scientists formally define what counts as stable enough to be a molecule? Is there an official line?
Well, IUPAC, the international chemistry body, suggests a practical definition. They say a molecule corresponds to a depression on the potential energy surface.
The energy landscape based on atom positions.
Right. A depression deep enough to hold at least one vibrational state.
So it needs a little energy well to sit in.
Pretty much. And this definition is interesting because it can include even really weakly bound things like the helium dimer,
Well,
He2,
two helium atoms stuck together. I thought they didn't bond.
only by incredibly weak forces, van der Waals forces, and only at super low temperatures. The well is very shallow, but technically deep enough by that definition.
Huh.
So the key takeaway is that the definition isn't some absolute fundamental thing. It's an operational definition. It's a useful concept that helps scientists make sense of how atoms interact on that scale.
A tool for understanding, not a rigid box. That makes a lot of sense.
Exactly. It's our way of trying to categorize the complexity of matter at that level.
Well, this deep dive, pulling from that Wikipedia page, has been incredibly illuminating. We've seen how the definition evolved, where molecules are found pretty much everywhere, but not everything is molecular, and how quantum mechanics underpins their structure and properties.
It's a huge topic covering so much ground.
It really is. And that leads us to a final thought for you, the listener. Given this sort of operational definition and these weakly bound states like He2, where do you draw the line? When do interacting atoms become a true molecule?
Yeah. What are the implications of that fuzzy boundary? Maybe in an atmospheric chemistry with fleeting interactions or understanding exotic states of matter.
Something to ponder. The molecular world is vast, often unseen, but always fascinating, and discoveries are still being made.
Absolutely. Keep that molecular perspective in mind as you look at the world around you.